and welcome to the Atma Paradigm, consciousness-based science. We're now on number 6 of this series on consciousness, and today we are looking at introducing the Atma. So, introducing the Atma, an alternative approach to explaining consciousness. Now, why are we doing this? Well, you know that for the last 5 lectures, we've really been going through all the other ideas that try to explain consciousness in terms of it being a function of the brain. So here we are so far. Here's our intuition, the knowledge that I exist. I am a conscious being. I see, I feel and experience. I am the I, the conscious self, the observer, the witness, the subject of my experiences. And I am the same self throughout my life. And I want fulfillment and blissful pleasure. So those were the intuitions. And we feed those in to an idea that these indicate that consciousness doesn't reduce to the physical. And we also looked at that there was no direct evidence for the brain model. There was only circumstantial justification. And we're actually going to look at some of that later today. There is no current plausible theory. Many theories, but none of them accepted, none of them explaining consciousness as we understand it to be. And there ultimately is no justification for asserting that the brain produces consciousness. And all efforts to reduce consciousness to known physical properties have failed. So let's feed that in. Neuroscience basically concludes that consciousness is irreducible. And we looked at QUALIA, the Achilles heel of the whole idea that the brain can produce consciousness. We showed that QUALIA contain non-neural, non-physical qualities. They cannot be explained in reference to the brain. Therefore, the experience of QUALIA is not a physical experience. And you can then say that the self, that entity that experiences the phenomenon of QUALIA, is also de facto. On the basis of all of this, it is also non-physical. So we feed philosophy of mind into this. Consciousness is irreducible. Now, I haven't actually presented this as the direct evidence yet. Actually, that's going to be next week. But believe me, that will also feed into consciousness is irreducible. So where does this get us? Well, David Chalmers, the philosopher we quoted earlier, who was one of the key persons who defined the hard problem of consciousness, claimed there is an explanatory gap between the functions of the brain and the experience, i.e. our experience of qualia and personal subjectivity, and we need an explanatory bridge to cross it. We need an extra ingredient. So we're going to bring in some new ideas, and we're going to take our lead from the Vedic tradition. And the Atma Paradigm actually draws many insights from the tradition, ancient tradition of India, which are encapsulated between 3 particular schools of thought: Vedanta, Sankhya, and Yoga. And I have just put them in this little box, the Vedas. So they're going to help us not only understand consciousness as being irreducible, but to propose that our conclusion must be that it is a distinct fundamental property. Now we draw a little bit of encouragement from Sherlock Holmes. You know his famous statement that once you have removed everything that is impossible and you've shown that they don't work, then whatever you're left with, even if it sounds improbable, it must be the truth. And pretty well we've reached that point with consciousness. We've seen that we cannot deal with it through anything we know in modern physics and in terms of what we've got in the brain. So we need to be inventive. We need to be a little bit open-minded in order to explore this idea that perhaps consciousness is its own distinct fundamental property. So what if it is? Yeah, what if consciousness is an irreducible property of another form of reality, distinct from all the known physical properties? Perhaps we can say a field of consciousness. Now, this might seem a little outrageous to just come out and make this sort of claim, but frankly, this is how it works in modern physics. If you make some observations in physics and you need something to explain something, a function that you've observed or can show, you just postulate some new stuff. You know, for instance, if you need to figure out, well, how does mass become embedded within fundamental particles? Well, maybe there's a property making field that gives mass, and that's what the Higgs boson is, the particle that's related to that particular field. And then you spend billions and billions of pounds and euros looking for it. So similarly in astrophysics, if you can't understand how the galaxies hold together as they spin round, well, then you can postulate dark matter. If you can't understand how the universe seems to be accelerating away from itself, you know, all the different parts accelerating into space, then you can say, well, there's something new that's pulling it apart. We call that dark energy. We don't know what dark energy or dark matter could be, but we're willing to postulate them because they fulfill an explanation. And I will suggest that we can approach consciousness in this way. We cannot explain it through the physical kind of properties. Therefore, we're obliged to postulate that consciousness is its own particular field. And like other fields, it has its own fundamental particle, the Atma. At last you understand why we call this the Atma Paradigm. So, what do we mean by the Atma? It is the smallest unit composed of and possessing a quantum of the property of consciousness. Its consciousness is the inherent property of ourselves as the subject, the witness, the observer of everything. And consciousness is not something we have. What's being suggested here is consciousness is that thing that we are. Consciousness, not what we have, but what we are. We are this individual entity composed of and possessing a quantum, the tiniest particle, the tiniest amount of consciousness that can exist individually. Another phrase that I remember hearing many years ago from a devotee called Sadhaputta Das, he always defined the Atma as a non-physical ordering particle possessing a quantum of consciousness. Now, this puts the Atma in its own category. And I like this word sui generis. You cannot categorize consciousness and the Atma into other stuff that you know in physics or in philosophy. We have to put it in its own category. So in philosophy, sui generis refers to an idea, an entity or reality that cannot be reduced to a lower concept or included within a higher concept. So that's how we're looking at the Atma. It's a Sanskrit term. And we borrow it because it has certain precision. Some people might translate it as the soul, but the soul is a word that has its own kind of connotations and maybe baggage, and everyone kind of interprets it in a very different way. And I would like us all just to focus in on considering this postulation of the Atma in a particular precision that we require. So we're saying the Atma is the seer, the witness, the observer, the original self beyond any identification with phenomena, i.e. with the stuff that's in our minds, with the external world. It's that self who is the observer. The Yoga Sutras use a slightly different word. Patanjali uses the word Purush when he's referring to the Atma, but the concept is exactly the same, it's just a different phrasing. So the Atma, an individual, personal entity. Now, I would put it to you that, well, we had a lot of theories last week. Is this just another theory? No, because so many of the theories we looked at last week are the products of one or a few minds, tried to be pieced together actually in quite recent times. Whereas what we're presenting in the Atma paradigm actually draws on the accumulated wisdom and the propositions and theses of some of the most advanced schools of thought. We mentioned Vedanta, Sankhya, and Yoga. And it incorporates the insights, what I would call dedicated consciousness scientists, sages, yogis, meditators who spent their whole lifetime deeply immersed in trying to understand the nature of their own consciousness, extricated from all the thoughts involved in this world. That's a big sacrifice to make, to actually try and remove your thinking and concerns and your ideas from all the world around you and just focus it purely internally so that you can actually understand consciousness as it is without all the chatter of your mind and the feeding of the input of your senses. That's a huge dedication. And it's on the basis of that type of work, research, study, that we have this wonderful kind of compilation of the science of the subjective. And because it's a science of the subjective, some people complain, well, you know, it's not empiric, it's not third person, but everyone knows that you cannot study consciousness from a third person empirical type of science. It is a subjective study. So science has either got to say we can't deal with it, fine, or then just let us get on with the science of the subjective. But an important thing is it's one that you can join in. We're not asking you to start believing in something that you cannot prove to yourself. We're asking you to explore the nature of your own consciousness through this process. Now, one of the aspects that is often discussed in terms of consciousness is this idea of the theatre of consciousness. This particular concept goes back to Descartes, but in recent times Bernard Bars presented it as part of his global workspace theory. And the analysis kind of works like this, that there's a stage and there's stuff going on backstage. You don't get to see that. And even that which is on the stage, you know, you're not aware of everything all at the same time. Rather, the spotlight might pick up a particular character. In this case, we've got King Lear and Cordelia being highlighted by the spotlight. So this is kind of the selective attention, which, as he explains, controls what you experience. Now, this is an intuitive description of how we experience what is in our minds. And I think it's important. Now, a lot of the researchers and physicalists, philosophers don't like this concept of the theatre of consciousness for one very good reason. It begs a question. Well, if there's selective attention on certain things that are happening on the stage, who's that for? Who's the guy sitting in the audience watching this? That becomes the question. So this is just another aspect of introducing the idea of consciousness as the observer. Now, with this in mind, I'd like you to look at these two pictures. They're taken from two big films. The one on the bottom left is from Terminator 2. This is an image where the director is showing us what's going on in the Terminator's robotic mind. And on the top right is an image from Iron Man. Dr. Stark wearing his iron suit that has all these amazing kind of powers. So, two pictures, but one of them has a very bad philosophical error. Besides the spelling mistakes and other things, which one has the philosophical error? Think for a moment. You may not like the films, but that's not a reason to complain about them. The philosophical error, of course, belongs to the image from the Terminator, because this is meant to be a robot with a special chip that gives it all its abilities. And the question is, why does a robot or a computer require to present the data that is coming in through its sensors in a digital form like this, or in a kind of display form? Why does it have, one part of the computer does not have to generate a picture for another part of the computer to see the picture, or present it in text format so that the computer, oh yes, that's what this other part of my processing is all about. So that is a complete philosophical error. It doesn't work like that. Whereas the image of Iron Man is different. That's showing an individual human being inside the machine of his suit, and it has also got its sensors, but it needs then to communicate the information that those sensors are picking up from the environment around it in order to communicate to this poor human sitting inside it. So we ask the simple question, why do computers have a screen? It's not for the benefit of the processor, it's for the benefit of the operator, because the computer is trying to turn the data that it's got into some kind of format that can communicate what's going on to something that is not itself. In this way, there are kind of four functions in computing. On the right, we see sensors, picking up information, whether it's a camera, microphone, could be temperature, could be a touch thing, and it's feeding that data into the processor, the black box, with all the little electrical kind of symbols are. And that's fine. The processor can deal with that. If you've got a car, it can have sensors, it can have reversing kind of sensors which pick up that you're getting near, bumping into something. It sets off a beep. It's setting off a beep to tell you as the driver. It doesn't require to do that for itself. So information is taken by the processor and it is then presented on the interface. In this case, we showed a screen. Yes, the dog again. The picture of the dog appears on the screen for the benefit of the operator. And we can use that simple model, which we understand for computing, to match actually what seems to be going on within ourselves. We have the five senses picking up information. They send digital data into the brain. That is being processed. But we know that the brain doesn't have the picture that we experience. So we need to suggest that there are two further functions beyond the brain. One of them we will call for now mind. Now mind is a very general and again misunderstood term. People use it in all sorts of ways. And we will need to clarify that in due course. But for now, it's satisfactory. We're talking mental stuff. So somehow or other, that data of the brain is being transformed into a format that presents pictures, feelings of sounds and sensations and emotions, which then are being experienced by the Atma. So we are separating the principle of the Atma as the observer from the subtle mental information and separating the mental information from the physical data of the brain. So this is a simple presentation of our model, that we have Atma as the observer, mind as the interface, and the brain as a processor trying to deal with all the various inputs from the senses. We can look at this, just take those and put them into these categories. We put the brain, body, and the senses. That's all kind of one package. In using the Sanskrit again, we would call that the sharira, that's the body. And chitta, This is a kind of general term for the contents of our mind, the interface, the mental functions. And then the Atma, the operator, consciousness functions. So please note that what we're analyzing here is that there are discrete functions which need to be accounted for in any model which deals with our perception and experience of the world. Now, it's pretty typical for someone then to say to me, well, yeah, so what is mind made of? What is consciousness made of? But please understand that that's actually a distraction. Before we're able to talk about what consciousness is made of, we need to know what matter is made of. And when you ask a physicist, well, what is matter made of? There is no answer. No physicist will tell you we know what matter is made of. Now you might think, well, that's ridiculous. We know, the world's made of molecules and they're made of atoms. We now know what atoms, we've got protons and neutrons and electrons, and protons are made from quarks. There's up and down. 3 quarks which make a proton, and up, down, and down make a neutron. Yeah, but wait a minute. We finally get to this stage of defining matter in terms of atoms, and particularly of quarks and electrons and photons. These are things we cannot experience directly. We can only define them because, in terms of the functions we need them to have, the properties that they need to have in order to fulfill those functions, to explain what we see them do. So we only know what matter is like and what it does. Its properties and its functions, not what it is. So let's deal with mind and consciousness in exactly the same way without getting distracted and worried about the ontology at this stage. We will look at it more deeply once we've got the functions and everything else clarified. So consciousness functions for the Atma, mental functions for the mind, and biological and physical functions for the brain, body, and senses. Now, we mentioned the 5 justifications last week that were used to as the rationale for the brain model. And I said, well, they were circumstantial and they probably could apply to other things as well. So what I'm going to do now is just use that model that I have, the Atma, mind and brain, and let's apply these 5 justifications and see if they also corroborate the Atma Paradigm model. So the first one was, the sectors with the most connected networks within the brain seem to be those that are associated with the reporting of conscious experience. Now that's kind of duh. Yeah, of course. You would expect that just as in a computer, if you've got an area that is to handle all the integration, you'd expect that to have more connections, more activity than some of the other bits which are only used more rarely. So similarly, in the brain, you would expect that those areas that are integrating the information, which is then to be brought together and producing output, because somehow or other that's what's needed. There is the information has to be integrated, but something is taking that information and using it as output in order to generate the actual mental content of qualia, which is what the Atma experiences. Then there's the second one was that there's subconscious processing going on. And I mentioned that this actually doesn't seem to be in favor of the brain model, but it's one of the points that they use. So somehow or other in the brain, you've got all the yellow flashes. Those are the unconscious bits, but we're conscious of the magenta colors. So just only part of what the brain is producing or processing are we conscious of, and that's the theory. Now, if you put that in terms of a computer, why would a computer generate consciousness over one aspect of its data, but not the other? That seems to be really weird. So it kind of indicates we're not the computer. But there is a reason why some of the data in a computer is actually used, because it is being exported to the interface, and that's the bit that we become conscious of. So let's just think of it like this. Here you are on the right, walking down a street, and there's so much going on. Your senses are being kind of overloaded with, impressions. It's a sunny day, there's vivid colors, there's a lot of sound, there's chatter, there's things to look at, and then there's also some smells. And out of everything that's going on in the street, you've just picked up the smell of a samosa being cooked. So although all that data is going into the brain, what you are focusing in on is that nice aroma of the samosa being fed through to you. And this is typical of our way of experiencing. We as the conscious entity do not actually, we're not aware of everything that our senses are giving us. If I ask you this now, your body is picking up so much information. But when did you last worry about what your feet were feeling in touch with the ground? We weren't worrying about that. But as soon as I mention it, your attention then goes, well, how do my feet feel? What does it feel like to touch the ground? So that's focused attention, which we didn't have. We are ignoring so much. So that's typical. We actually, as the conscious entity, don't require to know everything that's going on. And it's like this. With your computer, open up Task Manager if you've got a PC, and just see all the crazy applications that are going on behind the scenes. Are you interested in them? Nope, we don't care. We just want the gratification. We just want the data that's coming through on the screen, the interface. That's how we are with our brain. We don't care everything that the brain may be processing. And it's doing a lot of autonomic kind of manipulation and sending message to different parts of your body to make sure that you breathe properly, that your heart's work, that all sorts of things are functioning. So the brain's doing a lot of really nice stuff for us, but we ain't worried. We're not worried about that. Because for our point of view, we're in this body for gratification. We want to know where's the juice, where's the pleasure that you can give us. That's what we're interested in. Basically, the Atma is saying to the mind, and the mind is just saying to the mind, just give me the qualia. Just keep presenting stuff on the screen of my experience. Just like, I just want to see nice videos of cats playing the piano. Just give me the gratification. The third justification is that brain damage, there's a relationship between damage to the brain or the use of anything that affects the neural activity and our mental states. Now, as we mentioned when we looked at this, that this doesn't stop us being conscious, it just changes what we are conscious of. So there is an adjustment to our state of consciousness, but not the fact that we are conscious, because only that which is consciousness can experience a state of consciousness or content of consciousness. So normal functioning is, as we've just described, the yellow bits are the subconscious things that are whirring around in the background of the computer or our brains, but the lilac magenta ones, that's what's being presented on the interface, either of the computer on the screen or on our mind. That's our normal functioning. So when there's damage to the computer, then not all the yellow things are working. There's red. Those are the things that are going wrong. And there is an interruption to that which is being sent through from the processor onto the screen. We get a big error message. So in the same way, when there's any damage or neurological change, this causes change in the output to the interface. So what the mind is getting then becomes changed. Hence, there is a change in content or state of mind. This actually is explained in a very interesting verse in the Srimad Bhagavatam, a text which I'm going to mention a bit later as well, where it explains that when through trauma, in deep sleep, in fainting, and different other circumstances, there can be interruption of the flow of data into the mind. And therefore, we appear to experience a certain blankness. But we're not conscious, we're just conscious of blank. That's a difference. We're conscious, because there's nothing being fed through to us in the mind, we feel like we're experiencing nothing. But that doesn't mean we are not conscious, we're just experiencing nothing or practically nothing. So this is the way it works for us. The outside world, it goes into through our eyes, it's processed in our brains, but if there's some kind of disorder there, we're getting the error message within the mind. Thoughts and actions. Now this does seem a very strange one to try and justify the brain model. The idea was that thoughts that go on in the brain and leading to actions of the body, they're connected, so thinking and the body must all be part of the one thing. Not necessarily. It really is the outside world is feeding information to the brain, the mind is presenting that data to us as a picture of the quality of the form and colour of the apple, and we're looking at it and we're thinking, that's very nice. I see an apple, I would like to eat an apple. So the next thing that happens is that a thought or towards an action, get me an apple, you know, and then the brain has to again put the body and the arms into motion, grab the apple, pop it in the mouth, and again we've got that qualia. So thoughts and actions, but it fits perfectly within the model that we are suggesting, separating the functions of consciousness, the mind, and the brain. And just to give you some more aspects of how these work together. There's actually two types of thought. There's thought, there's different kind of meanings of thought, but there's two types of thought as a mental activity. One is associative thinking. Now this is the sort of kind of reverie, daydreaming thinking that we all go through, where the mind just kind of flows and it's just going from one thought to the next and we're just following. We're not really attending to it, we're not really paying much attention, we're just letting it flow, just watching it. But then occasionally that a thought will come up, bang, oh yes, that reminds me of something, and then we become very attentive and focused. So that's one type of flow that we get from our minds. But you can kind of understand what is happening there. It appears that we as the observer are just the recipient of a flow of presentation in the interface of the mind. The other type is logical. Now this is where there's a certain direction. And for instance, if you're challenged with a proposition, and if I said to you, democracies do not start wars, you have to think about that for a moment. And the way we actually deal with the mind is interesting. We would then think, well, what do I think about that? I need to set up a question. What do I know about democracies and wars? Can I remember anything, you know? It's almost like you're starting to kind of Google it with the mind. You're setting up questions. And you basically then sit back and just wait for the answers to come. And you kind of sift through them and ask the next question and information comes. So this model explains, is at least in concert with how we do our thinking. And one of the interesting things is that we mentioned before about the inner voice that we hear within the mind, speaking to us in a kind of language. They actually worked out that that voice needs to sound a bit like us. And we have to believe that that is us. But actually it's a kind of, it's not us, it's a voice we are hearing, and therefore it has a qualia aspect to it. And indeed, they've now found through experiments that it even has an accent. Your inner voice has an accent, probably related to where your upbringing, etc., etc. And the way they did that was to get people to read some lines of poetry which are meant to rhyme, but the person would read it silently to themselves, just in their mind, and see if it rhymed. And a good example would be, if you're from Newcastle, you could say, you pronounce the word town as tune. So if there was a line that read, the man went down to Newcastle town and he bought himself a balloon. Now, if you read that to yourself, it wouldn't rhyme. But if you were from the northeast of England, you would read, the man went down to Newcastle town and bought himself a balloon. So you would actually hear it right. Anyway, that's how they reckon that even your inner voice has an accent. I included this because a lovely kind of meme that appeared on the internet. My mind is like an internet browser. There are 19 tabs open. 3 of them are frozen, and I have no idea where the music is coming from. That's our relationship with the mind summed up in a little meme. The fourth one is that it follows evolution. That somehow, was it the fifth one rather, that it follows the assumed development of species. That little creatures have small brains and don't seem to have much consciousness, and as you go up the scale or the hierarchy that is assumed, you get to humans, and we've got bigger brains and therefore more consciousness. Therefore, brains and consciousness seem to go together. But that's kind of natural. The more that you are trying to do with your consciousness, perhaps the better the equipment that you would need. Just as you need bigger mainframe computers to crunch all the data of, that the Large Hadron Collider is producing, you're not going to put that on a laptop. So similarly, species are equipped with brains concomitant to the levels and functions of the consciousness that they're able and allowed to exhibit. So on to the Atma. I'd like to present you 12 features of the Atma. And this is taken from the Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 7, Chapter 7, and this is text 19. Srimad Bhagavatam is a really important text for those who don't know it. Vedanta philosophy is found throughout the Upanishads, and there's 108 and more Upanishads, which are the philosophical parts of the Vedic literatures. And things are spread out, so there's bits in here and there and everywhere. The Vedanta Sutra, or the Brahma Sutras, was the effort to bring all that information and to categorize it and to go through it systematically. So it takes all the information of the Upanishads and presents it systematically. But it is done in sutras, short phrases, which require a little bit of explanation to really understand what they're each referring to. But it's fully compiled. And the Puranas, and particularly the Srimad Bhagavatam, is then said to be the full explanation and elaboration of the Vedanta Sutras. So it's got all the data, all the information of the Upanishads, categorized and now elaborated. And one of the key concepts of Vedanta is Atma. And here are the 12 features that the Srimad Bhagavatam explains in relationship to the Atma. The first, Eka, single. It is, we are unified, we are singular, we're an individual entity. And this fulfills that aspect that we know of ourselves. I am an individual conscious being. This is the unified, in John Searle's unified qualitative subjectivity. The second one, Svadrik, that the Atma is self-illuminated by its own consciousness. And this is the point that we made earlier, that the Atma is possessed of consciousness, and that consciousness is what illuminates our awareness. It is not something we have. We do not have any external, extraneous mechanism. We are the conscious entity. And this deals with Daniel Dennett's critique of the Cartesian theatre. Dennett puts it like this, that okay, you're trying to tell me that what's happening is that there's some kind of screen inside our heads and that there is someone, an entity, watching that screen. and they call the this entity watching the screen the homunculus, the little man. So he says, okay, so you've got a little man watching the screen. All right, and that's your explanation of consciousness. Ah, but then what mechanism is that person got in order to understand what's going on? Does that mean that he needs another person inside him watching the screen of his mind, and then there has to be someone else within that person's head watching the screen of their mind, and so on and so on ad infinitum? And it doesn't take a Vaishnav or a Vedanta scholar to be able to answer that one. In fact, many other philosophers said, no, you've been stupid. If we're talking about something that is possessed and composed of consciousness, then it is conscious itself. The situation ends with it. You know, you don't need this infinite regression. So, the next one, Vyapaka, that the Atma's awareness extends throughout the body. And we're aware that wherever we seem to have kind of awareness of every part of our body, and certainly very clear awareness and very precise awareness wherever blood flows. You know, the tips of our hairs, blood's not flowing, or the end of our nails, no. But throughout our body, the Atma's awareness is spread. And this other phrase, kshetra gya, this refers to the Atma as the one who knows, but is different from the sense experiences of the body. So we are the one who knows what's going on in the body, and the body and its activities are described as a kind of domain or a field. Not in a field in the physics sense, but a field, or as I just mentioned earlier, field of consciousness, but field in terms of the kind of domain of our experience. And we are the gya, that which knows that what's going on within that. So the Atma is the kshetra gya. So we are the knower of the field, but we are different from it. Anavrataha and Shuddha, these two kind of go together. That the Atma is not affected by material properties, and it is Shuddha, without attachment to material issues. Now, I have to say, I'm just going through these very quickly. Each of these kind of has huge import, and we will be going back and exploring aspects of these 12 features as they come up in further analysis in future talks. And this is, these two are kind of important in that aspect. That what's been suggested here is that the Atma, although it is the experiencer of what's going on in your mind, and therefore it is aware of everything, of what's happening in your body, it's not affected by it, and it is not contaminated by it, and it is not changed by it. That's the interesting thing. And one way to understand how the Atma actually relates to the mind and the body is to consider the theatre or the cinema again. Here we have a bunch of friends sitting in the cinema. They've got their popcorn and their drinks and they're enjoying it happily, but suddenly there's a horrible, frightening scene and they all kind of are upset. Now, nothing has actually changed in their existence. They're sitting quite comfortably. They might have spilled a little popcorn or their drink, but really nothing has happened to them. It's just that they are identifying so closely with what is happening on the screen that they have allowed their mentality, what their awareness of, and of the emotions and of the feelings, they've allowed those to be changed. But their ability to be conscious is never affected. But when we identify with stuff, we kind of we make this kind of mental, psychological connection with it. But actually we are not, so we are always separate from it, and we can always pull back from it. Now, two more. Avyakriya, that the Atma does not change like the body. And avyaya, it doesn't dwindle or decay like the body. So those two things, that we know the body goes through changes, but The Atma does not change in that way. And the next one is Nitya. Now, this is a very important one, and these particular statements, these three, indicate that the Atma as the observer is not changing along with everything else that we're observing. So we'll say that the Atma is non-temporal or atemporal, which means it is not temporal. It is not a thing affected by time. So think of it like this. Here's one moment. Here's the next. Then you're now experiencing this. Now you're experiencing that. Now you're experiencing the green light, the yellow, and the red. Now you may think that's entirely random, but apparently that's the sequence of the new traffic lights in Korea. So it means something. But think of the passing of time, that it's like a conveyor belt, that the future slides T1 to T4 are now sliding past you. And on the screen they're kind of going to the left, and the grey ones that have gone are the past. But the present is the moment, is T0. That's what we're looking at this moment, right? And then in the next moment we'll be looking at the next one, which currently is labeled T1, and so on. So every moment is passing us by like that, and we are the one aware of each moment, and we are the same person experiencing that change. So time is changing that little man walking, but time is not changing that which is observing the man walking. So we are different to that which is being changed and affected by time. We are simply the entity which is watching the change that time produces on the world around us and on the things in our brain and even the things in our mind. So this actually is the key aspect which separates the function and properties of consciousness from all the other types of properties and functions that we've talked about, whether in the physical world or whether even in the mental world. That the function of consciousness is the only one of these that is non-temporal, that doesn't change with time. It is the only one that is nitya. That puts it in a very special category all of its own. And building on that, the Bhagavatam then says that the Atma is asangi. It is not dependent on the body, meaning that the Atma doesn't require to have a body in order to be conscious and to exist. Now that's something that is new for us. But I thought the body and the consciousness must go together, you know. And there's a lot of philosophers who absolutely believe that what is consciousness without a body? But actually what is being explained here is that we don't change, everything around changes. And ultimately we're not dependent. And of course, this is brought out in the Bhagavad Gita and in the beautiful kind of diorama and exhibitions that we have done of the changing bodies. So here we're using the word soul just because it's a quote from the Bhagavad Gita. As the embodied soul continually passes in this body from boyhood to youth to old age, the soul similarly passes into another body at death. A sober person is not bewildered by such a change. Now that's bringing in a whole new kind of aspect. I'm not asking you to accept it now. We're going to have a look at the implications of that particular point of view in a bit. A couple more. Hetu. This means that the soul has causal effect. Hetu in Sanskrit means cause. So that means the Atma has a certain, we would call that agency. But this is quite a complex issue, and we're going to be spending some time a little bit later on in another talk dealing with this one. That causal effect is produced from the volition or the will of the Atma. The key point being made here is that the Atma is a source of free will. So whereas some other theories want to deny the idea of free will, which we all know we have, the Atma paradigm establishes that actually no, this sense of will or volition actually is part of the feature and property of the Atma, We have causal effect through volition, but we're not necessarily the doer. But we'll talk about that another day. Then Ashraya, that the Atma is the origin, the foundation, and the shelter. Now, there is this verse in the Srimad Bhagavatam indicates that the word Atma refers to both the cause and the the idea of ultimate super consciousness as well as the individual consciousness. But even for the individual Atma, you and me, we need to actually understand ourselves in this context, the origin, the foundation, and the shelter. We don't mean of everything, but we do mean in terms of the situations and the circumstances that I find myself in. This is the indication that the Atma is responsible for its own destiny. And we'll explore that more. Now we can take these 12, and I'm going to group them into three sets. The first are those phrases which relate to our sense of existence. And there's a word in Sanskrit, sat. This means related to existence. So those are the avya, non-deteriorating, ashraya, the foundation, avikriya, not undergoing change, and nitya, unchanging, non-decaying, non-temporal, permanent, eternal. All right? And then the next four relate to knowing, chit, ekaha, that I am an individual person who experiences knowledge. Kshetraga, I'm the knower of the field of my experience. Svadrik, I'm self-illuminated with consciousness. Vyapaka, that consciousness spreads throughout my body. And the third one, Ananda. Ananda Moyabhasat, says the Vedanta, that the Atma is naturally joyful. And because of that, we can recognize that these four are connected with our desire, a natural kind of ability to enjoy pleasure, experience joyful bliss, if you like. Shuddha, without material attachment. We talked about that earlier, that connection with the body, as much as it brings us pleasure, there's also aspects which give us kind of other experiences of pain and misery. Asangi, we're not dependent on the body. Anavrita, we're not covered by the material properties. We don't have to just experience a roller coaster of our mind. We can actually establish the mind in equanimity and higher pleasure. Hetu, we are the cause of volition. That means that we have the ability to change the experiences we're going through in order to gain pleasure and avoid pain. So, Sat, Chit, Ananda. This is sometimes described as the constitution of the Atma, existence, knowing, pleasure. And there's a fourth that we're not going to get into too much now, called Vigraha, which is related to the form. But the idea is that Sat, Chit, Ananda, Vigraha means that we're defining the Atma as the form of the entity composed of the potencies of existence, knowledge, and bliss. So that kind of gives us our definition. And now I just want to kind of, I've gone on quite long. This was quite a long section. Good time if you've got any questions. Pop them into the boxes in the Facebook. While I'll just give a short kind of summary of what we've covered today. So the various forms of evidence reveals the need that we need to postulate consciousness as a fundamental property. It doesn't work there's no other theory that seems to be able to handle it. So we're obliged to try something different. An explanatory gap, we need an explanatory bridge. We're proposing the Atma. And we're proposing it as the entity composed of and imbued with consciousness. And third, that the mind is a non-neural interface. So then we're saying the mind is not neural, but it is not of the same property or function as the Atma. We're kind of giving it its own discrete function. And we're doing that because we see that there's different functions. We need different aspects of reality to handle them. So the mind is a non-neural interface facilitating the interaction between the Atma and the body. And this model better fulfills the justification given for the brain model. So those justifications were based on observations, and you would expect that, you know, a good theory would account for them. And we actually find that they help to substantiate the Atma paradigm even better than the brain model. And The 12 key features of the Atma, as we just explained from Vedanta, those are going to be used in future talks to help us develop the Atma Paradigm model. We're not asking you to believe them simply because they are statements of the Vedas. Rather, we're drawing on them as insights. Why? Because of the incredible dedication of the sages and thinkers and the yogis and the meditators put in to gathering that information. We haven't got anything like that in modern society or in recent kind of history. So we'd be foolish to ignore those consciousness scientists. They have something to offer here. And what you will see as we go through and apply their insights is that it really picks up on all the modern scientific evidence that we have and helps to make sense of it all. So let's move on to the Q&A. I've got a question here. Let me read it. In logical thinking, is it the Atma who is looking through the mind and then choosing the thoughts or thought streams that it wishes to believe? This is yes. The simple answer is yes, but there are nuances to how that mechanism actually works. And in order to really understand how that mechanism of how we as the conscious observer kind of sift through everything in our mind and receive specific stuff from the mind, then deal with that. And there's we have to look at we will be looking at the distinct functions that happen within the mind, and in a future talk we will be identifying 3 sub-functions of what we call mind: persona, discrimination, or sometimes called intelligence, and the kind of pool of the ideas. So these are 3 distinct functions that are happening within the mind, and together they're being utilized by us in order to gather the experience of mental stuff that we get to enjoy. So I hope that's helpful on that. I think that's, at the moment, that's the only question. We have gone a little bit over time, but I'd invite you all to come back next week for lecture number 7, which is Atma, the Evidence. I mentioned it earlier, and what we're going to present next week, we're going to look at some of the challenges that people might raise towards the Atma paradigm, but mainly we're going to be looking at the direct scientific evidence that substantiates this understanding that the Atma is distinct from the physical functions. So tune in for that. I think you'll find that a lot of fun and quite exciting, and you may even have your own stories to add to that. But thank you very much, and we'll see you all next week, 6 p.m. on Thursday, the 4th of June. Thank you.